here. If anybody can hear me, I would really appreciate you letting me know, because I have been talking, I think, to myself for about 5 minutes. Vimeo somehow appears to have failed me, and I'm not entirely sure what is happening. So I'm just going to pause here while we have a look at what is going on. So someone, Ruthie, if you're there, if you can let me know. I seem, oh great, okay, that's a great relief. Thank you so much, Erin. I have no idea what happened there. I was here at 4 o'clock and I put something in the chat box and I don't know, nothing happened. So I started talking and then I realized that something was very strange. So Vimeo sometimes does that. I'm not entirely sure why. I really appreciate you all hanging around while I fix my technical problems, and now I am in a complete pickle because all of my screen, which I had beautifully arranged so that I could see everything in the right place, is all over the place. So I hope you will just bear with me while I get myself back up and running, and then we will begin and see if we can avoid trickster energy, which I think we can call it quite comfortably, and just let the whole rest of the thing run smoothly. I guess there are quite a few of you there. I'm delighted to see it. I just want to say, unfortunately, for my own sanity and coherence while I am talking, I'm not going to be able to follow the chat, because if I try and do two things at once in that way, everything just goes to hell in a handbasket. So Ruthie is going to bear with you all on the chat, and if any of you are frozen or are having difficulties in listening to the live stream, I can assure you that it is not that is one thing that is not on my end, because I now have my control panel up and running. It is telling me that I have perfect streaming. So quite often the thing that you need to do is just refresh your browser and it will be there. So what are we doing here now that we are all here, including me? Welcome to the Bone Cave. This is my first event in this virtual space, and the idea of the Bone Cave began with a dream, in the way that so many things do. And it was one of those dreams where I can't actually remember the content, except that there was a cave and it was very dark, and there was a fire pit, and it was a very fine fire pit. And all that I remember is I woke up in the middle of the night saying to myself, I am the fire pit. And I couldn't quite figure out what that meant for a very long time. But in the way that it happens over periods of reflection, and particularly being out in the land and thinking about where my work was going to go next, where my journey was taking me next, it seemed to me that this holding of a kind of virtual space to talk about story and myth and other similar things really was what that meant. That idea of a fire pit, that idea that I am the fire pit, that I would be somewhere, a thing, I guess, an object around which you all gathered to share your experiences and your journey and your stories. So I hope that doesn't sound too grandiose. That wasn't how it was intended. It was just really intended to be a place, yeah, where we could all gather. So this is my first event in the Bone Cave, and it was suggested to me that I should do an event on If Women Rose Rooted. And that book was published about almost 5 years ago now. And I'm a little bit nervous about doing an event on the book. I don't really know why. I do lots of events online, but I'm a little bit nervous because it seems to me that something about that book has really taken on a bit of a life of its own. In that time, tens of thousands of copies have been sold, and without a single mainstream book review. So all of that has happened by word of mouth, with women and men buying it for their friends, for their children, for their partners, and it's really been quite a humbling phenomenon to watch. And I really don't mean any false modesty when I say that I do really think that the book has a life of its own, in the same way that I think that stories and images have lives of their own beyond us. And having miraculously managed to put it out into the world, it seems to be just going out there in a way that has nothing at all to do with me. and that is very humbling, and it's very, very satisfying. So thank you all for coming here to talk about the book. What I wanted to do really was to offer some reflections on some of the questions that I am asked all the time. I get a lot of emails that ask me the same kind of questions, and if I do events, I'm asked the same kinds of questions, and I thought I would just bring them all together and put them out there into the world once and for all, and also enable the possibility of people who wanted to ask questions about the book that I haven't answered in other places, to give them an opportunity to do so. So what I plan to do is to talk a little bit, just for those of you who might be curious about how the book came to be, to offer some reflections on how my perspectives on some of the issues I dealt with in the book have shifted or grown, or some of the ways in which the rug has been pulled out from underneath me, which it has in a few ways as time has gone on. And I plan to talk for a little bit and then to offer you the chance to ask me any questions. One of the things I'd like to say up front is that the web page on my website, from which you accessed, I hope, this live webinar, also there's a section where my publishers are offering a 25% discount on all 3 of my books. That's If Women Rose Rooted, The Enchanted Life, and Foxfire Wolfskin. So if you click on those links, you'll be able to save by ordering directly from them, which is lovely because it supports small independent publishers, which they are. And finally, at the end of this session, I'll offer you the opportunity to enter your email address in the chat box. And for clarification, the chat record is not published, so I am the only one who will see that and who will retain that. And if you do that, then I will pick anonymously, at random, I'll pick from that list of email addresses someone to receive a free gift, which will be a copy of the original edition of the book, the first edition of the book, and some postcards that I've had made up with quotes from this, mostly from If Women Rose Rooted, and a couple of other books too, and a little handmade gift from the land here in Wales. So I hope you'll all hang around long enough to enter that. I can only do it on the live webinar, I'm afraid. We can't do that any other way. So how did If Women Rose Rooted get written? Well, first of all, I should say that since I was a tiny child, I thought that the finest thing in the world would be to be a writer. But I really never thought, growing up in a very poor kind of working class council estate environment in the UK, that people like me wrote. I guess that wasn't the kind of book that I ever saw. It seemed to be other people who wrote books. So although I thought that would be a very fine thing to be, a dream really, I never really thought that I could do it. And by the time I understood, maybe probably as late as my 20s, that I probably could be a writer, it really kind of, I didn't really feel as if I had anything to say. And although I wanted to write fiction very badly, I was very much conscious that I didn't want to write it just for the sake of it, and I wanted to wait until I had something to say. So it wasn't really until, those of you who've read If Women Rose Rooted will know this story, until I was kind of hovering on the brink of 40 and probably in my 3rd midlife crisis. I seemed to have a lot of them running into each other at the time, and had decided to take up flying to overcome a fear of flying, as you do. That coming out of the other side of that journey, which I won't spend time on now, I actually felt that that was part of a story I wanted to tell. So I wrote my first novel, The Long Delirious Burning Blue, or as my husband calls it, The Long Delirious Burning Title. It is a bit, but it's a line from a very beautiful poem. And that was published in 2008 when I was 47. So it took a while for me to find my voice. And I never really thought that I would write non-fiction. But it happened. It happened that way. What happened was that I was running a small literary press with my husband David, and we were running a magazine for nature writing called Earthlines. The first of its kind, really, in the UK. A little bit like Orion in the US, for those of you who might know that. And an agent approached me, my lovely agent Kirsty McLachlan, and said, "Have you ever thought about writing a book on place and belonging?" And I hadn't. But of course, once an agent approaches you, which is a rare thing for a writer, I suddenly did. And I put together a proposal and wrote some chapters, and out it went into the world. And curiously, perhaps, it didn't have very much success with publishers. I think it was bad timing in many ways, until a startup publisher at the time called September Publishing, with a very wonderful Hannah MacDonald at its helm, decided that they were kind of interested in the book, but not necessarily as I had proposed it. So, to cut a very long story short, Hannah and I had a conversation, and in the course of that conversation, I decided I didn't want to write the book that she wanted, but I really wanted to write a book that had more to do with story and mythology, and particularly the native stories and mythologies of my land. And given that I had nothing to lose at that stage, I put it to Hannah, and she had been at the time, I think, on holiday in Portugal or somewhere like that, somewhere on the West Atlantic coast, the West Atlantic seaboard of Europe, and thinking about that whole stretch and how familiar it felt to her, and how it reminded her of the stories that she knew. And we had a lovely conversation about Celtic stories and the Western Atlantic seaboard, and out of that conversation, in the wonderful way that can sometimes happen, came a completely different proposal for a completely different book that I had no idea really I wanted to write, and that was If Women Rose Rooted. And that's kind of how it came. So I'm eternally grateful to Hannah and to September Publishing for taking a chance on what really was a slightly strange book, and I had no idea when I began to write it quite how it would turn out. And I also have to give credit to Hannah for telling me that if I wanted to write a book which in some respect, no matter how small, was making suggestions about how other people lived their lives, I really ought to make it quite autobiographical and tell people how I had lived my life. And that was not at all what I had in mind. But given that so many people seem to appreciate that aspect of the book in spite of my reticence to go there, again, I'm very grateful for her input. This was very much a collaboration between a writer and a publisher that is a rare and beautiful thing. So writing the book was a very difficult process, not just because I didn't really have a plan, but because that autobiographical aspect of it really did require me to go very deeply into parts of my own journey, parts of my own past, which I hadn't thought about for a very long time, and to reflect very profoundly on, amongst other things, or mostly it seemed, the mistakes that I had made along the way. So it meant coming to terms with a lot of stuff that, psychologist though I am, I hadn't really dealt with at all. And the writing of the book then was not so much therapy as a kind of problem-solving process where I oriented myself to everything I'd done in my life, and curiously a pattern did seem to emerge for me at that time and has held there ever since. And I'm eternally grateful for that process, painful though it was at the time. It was a chance to kind of step back and understand my journey. So there were a couple of different themes in the book which were very important to it, and I just wanted really to talk a little bit about a couple of those threads and what has shifted for me in the meantime, because that is often what I'm asked. And what I'm particularly asked very often is what on earth I am thinking of now about place, the importance of place and the importance of belonging. Because when I left off If Women Rose Rooted, I had moved from the Isle of Lewis and was firmly ensconced, I believed, in the wonderful, beautiful county of Donegal in Ireland. And I kind of thought I'd be there forever. And I've made that mistake before, again, as you'll know if you've read the book. So what changed? Because since that house in Donegal by the river that I called River Witch, where we planted those babies of ancient oak trees, I have been in 3 houses. So this is my 3rd house since that point, where yet again I thought I had settled and I'd learnt everything that I needed to know about place and belonging. By the time I had written my 2nd non-fiction book, The Enchanted Life, a couple of years later, I was settled in Connemara in Ireland, and that was a coming back full circle to a place that I had lived and moved to when I made what I always refer to as my first attempt at getting out of the wasteland. And I thought that was forever too, because it was beautiful that I had come full circle in that way, and there was nowhere to go after that, was there? And yet here I am again in another place. So I think the way that I have thought about that in the intervening time is that place really has been by far and away the biggest teacher of my life. And place is kind of a thread, and it's as if there's a thread attached to my heart, and when it pulls, I follow. And it's got to the stage where, having recognized that place is so much of a huge teacher to me, that I trust the process. So it's not something that I really believe that I initiate. I don't wake up one day and think, oh, I'm restless, where will I go now? Or this place is not perfect, where might I go to find another one? It really does seem to be that, and I have referred to myself, as many of you perhaps will know, as a serial router wherever I go. Actually, I do root very deeply in the place, but it seems that once I've learnt the lesson of that place, another place is calling. And the Isle of Lewis, which was the place that dominated If Women Rose Rooted, for sure was the biggest place teacher of my life. There's no question about that. It was like some grand love affair that couldn't possibly last forever, because it wasn't necessarily healthy to continue it forever. But that changed my whole approach to the world and my whole way of being in the world, and opened me up to what I've always referred to as falling into the lands dreaming, because that was a place where there was no one to talk to really, in the human sense. And so I spent my time talking to the land, and I do very much believe that whatever you talk to wakes up. And it woke up. It affected me in all of the ways that I wrote about in If Women Rose Rooted, and a few more, and really gave me an insight into the ways that the old concept of the Celtic otherworld work, that there is a place beyond the physical and the sensory world that we are surrounded by, which doesn't denigrate that world, but which overlaps it and enhances it and provides a kind of additional imaginal layer to it. And what I mean by that is, let's take a crow, which is my favourite bird to talk about. I always seem to revert to crows when I'm trying to use examples of this. I know very much what a crow is in the physical sensory world. It is, I know its habits, I know where it likes to lay its eggs, I know what it likes to eat, I know its behaviour, I know where it shows up, and its funny little trickstery kind of shrugs and all of that kind of thing. But when I see a crow in the real world, I see that, but I also see something beyond it. I see a kind of imaginal overlay of a crow in my mythology, which is, for example, the character of the Morrigan, the goddess who is associated with death, with rebirth, with battlefields, with the darker cave entrances to the other world, and with the mystery that is often very, very hard to define. And so being on Lewis, talking to crows, talking to rocks in that way, enabled me to see them not just, and I don't mean by just any kind of sense of inadequacy, but not just as physical objects in a physico-sensory world, but as mythical, imaginal beings who, if we can approach them in the right way, pull us into relationship with something beyond ourselves and beyond the physical and the everyday. So that really happened for me in Lewis, and changed my way of being in the world, and changed the way that I looked at place and the beings that inhabit it along with us. And led me onto that journey of saying, okay, place is my teacher. That's what I'm going to learn. Going back to Ireland was going back into the arms of a very close, comfortable friend, and I thought it would be forever. It has always been a haven for me and a place where I was inspired to do the creative work that was necessary to write another couple of books. And I don't think I could have written either If Women Is Rooted or The Enchanted Life or Foxfire Wolfskin in Lewis. I needed to feel that I was in a warmer, less challenging place, and that has always been Ireland for me. So now here I am in Wales, where we moved in March and landed here precisely a day before the very strict lockdown that happened to us all at the beginning of the year. And it was not an easy relocation, and it hasn't been an easy time since, but I'll come to that in a bit. And there's another coming back full circle, because before there was Connemara, there was Wales. And it's a really very strange thing. My mother, as again those of you who read the book will know, moved here when I went to university, and this part of Wales where I am now, precisely this part of Wales, was a kind of both a home and a second home to me for about 25 years. And my mother married a native to this land, and I guess I discounted it because it seemed to me to be her place, her journey, and not necessarily mine. But the truth is, the more that I look back on it, I learned so many things about how important wild places are to me in Wales before I ever discovered Ireland and before I ever discovered Connemara and the other places that were very close to my heart. So it seems very strange to me, and that the least expected thing, that pull on that thread would bring me back to the UK, and specifically would bring me back to Wales. But it did, and very firmly. My husband also is from Wales, so it was a coming home for him too. And there was a very strange sense of, although I've been in the wilds for many, many years, and that's always been really wild places, quite bleak places, bogs, treeless and grassless mountains. This is quite a pastoral place. I mean, it's not easy, it's cold, it's harsh, it's wet, but it is full of green fields and sheep, amongst other things. And it seems to have, coming back here, tapped into some strange childhood dream of kind of living in the Shire, I guess. And this is not the Shire, Hobbit-like in The Lord of the Rings. It's a little bit harsher than the Shire seemed to be, but nevertheless that kind of dream of a farming community, of the pastoral side by side with the wild, because I can see wild places from this house as well as the 8 acres of beautiful green fields that we have. So it's a journey here that I am still very much processing. I don't really quite know what it's about yet, but I'm hoping it'll be the last one. And the older I get, the harder I find it to leave places that I've loved so deeply. And every time you leave a place in which you have been so deeply rooted, even if it's been for what seems to be a short time, something breaks a little bit. So I am very cautious now about that pull on the thread. And I'm kind of hoping that this will be it, at least until I'm too old and decrepit to navigate the remote location that we are actually based in. So that's how my own journey has evolved, quite unexpectedly, in the way that journeys do. And the other thing that I wanted to say about place is that as I have, in that 5-year period since If Women Is Rooted was published, and you'll remember, I hope, at the end of it, that I talked to Sylvia Linstead, a writer from California, about the ways in which our ancestral stories and our kind of ancestral memories of place can impact on our lives in new countries. And I particularly focused in Sylvia's case on how, as an American born and bred, nevertheless her ancient European roots informed her relationship to place. In that 5-year period, in I think all of the in-person workshops that I have done and the online offerings, the vast majority of people who come to those have been from outside the UK, have been from North America or Australia, or what we might think of as the kind of Celtic diaspora. And that has been really interesting to me, that there is this strong sense of longing for an ancestral connection and for the ways in which ancestral wisdom can inform a life and a journey in a very, very different continent. And so that's been also the focus of a lot of my work. And I wrote about this a little bit in The Enchanted Life, and it's a huge subject, and I don't have time to talk about it in any great deal of detail here today. But I did want to say that it always seems to me that it's important for all of us, wherever we are, wherever we live, to understand that we have a heritage, a lineage, which ties us to people who were connected to the land in all of the ways that we tend to admire in other Indigenous cultures. And I hope I kind of convinced you in If Women Are As Rooted, and if I didn't, then there are lots of other things that I can offer to do that, that our native stories really are focused on living in balance and harmony with the land and with the other beings who inhabit this land with us, and with our human community as well. That this really is our heritage. We are no different from the other cultures that we admire. It is simply that those stories have been handed down to us not as cosmologies, not even as mythologies, but just as stories, just as entertainment for children. That's how these stories were first presented to me. I never saw them as a worldview, as a way of being in the world. I saw them just as stories, as entertainment. And it was that shift in my perception from seeing beyond the story to the ancestral cosmology, the worldview, delving into Celtic mythology, delving into the old religions and spiritualities of these lands, that I began to see them as something more, and to see them as a lineage that had lessons for all of us today. And so those old stories, for example, the story of the Cailleach, my favourite mythological being in the world, the old woman of Gaelic mythology who created and shaped the land, who was a very fierce guardian and protector of the land in the old stories, who personified the land in the old stories, who was so old that she was as old as the land in the old stories. That is a very powerful role model for today, for the challenges we face today, not just as women, but as people on this planet. So I feel that having these stories in our ancestry, in our lineage, gives us confidence to root, to delve into relationship with place, to connect with place, wherever we might find ourselves in the world and for however long we might be there. And it always seems to me that it is a moral obligation, genuinely I do mean that, a moral obligation, wherever we are in the world, to build a relationship with place, even if it's a place that we're not entirely comfortable with, that we find it hard to love, that we don't want to be forever. Nevertheless, that place it's our womb in a sense. It gives us life, it gives us air, it gives us food, it holds us. And rejecting a place and refusing to engage with it, or holding ourselves back from it, to me, if there was such a thing as a sin, then I guess to me that would be it. So I think it's really important that even if we feel dislocated in other countries, even if we feel that the land stories belong to other people, we nevertheless have the responsibility to create stories of our own in relationship with that land. So I suppose a lot of my thinking, a lot of my work, a lot of my teaching, workshops, courses and so on, since I wrote that last chapter of If Women Are As Rooted about place, about how our ancestral stories inspire us even outside of our native lands, in the diaspora, that would be a really, really big focus for me, and a big learning as I've travelled back to America, particularly to teach for the first time in many, many years over the past couple of years, obviously not this year with COVID situation, but listening to people's experiences and learning from those experiences has been a really, really big thing for me. And what I would say to all of you who have not heard me say this, perhaps in other places, who are joining this event from America, from Canada, from South Africa or Australia, who have ancestry in these lands, it's really important to me to respect the stories and the connections and the relationships of other native peoples in the lands that you inhabit. But I think it's also important to understand that the stories of any place do not stop with any one people and do not stop at any one time. And again, I really do think we have this obligation, we have this moral obligation to connect with the land, to build our own stories, not to appropriate the stories of other native peoples, but to look back at our ancestral stories and say, okay, how does knowing about the Cailleach, the old woman in my ancestral history, how does knowing about her and feeling my way into who she might be, how does that help me connect with the old woman archetype in my place? Because every place has an old woman, for example. You just have to look. And in The Enchanted Life, I wrote about ending up in Donegal after many, many years in the Isle of Lewis, very much connected to the stories there of the Cailleach, and finding what seemed to be the one place in Ireland where there were no stories of the Cailleach, and coming to recognize the old woman archetype in the herons, the grey herons that nested in a wood behind our house by the river, and seeing that old woman in the heron and creating this kind of mythical character called Old Crane Woman, who was part Cailleach, part heron, part me, I guess, in that iteration. So I think that immersing ourselves in these old stories, there's something in us that recognizes these ancestral characters, and if we embrace them, they will help us find stories, the same characters, the same archetypes in the lands that we inhabit now. So that has been a really, really strong thread in all of the work that I've done since If Women Rose Rooted. The other aspect, I guess, that I just wanted to touch on briefly is, in If Women Rose Rooted, I talked about the eco-heroine's journey, which I saw as a particular iteration of the heroine's journey, and it was a journey really back to place, back to a sense of connectedness to place and a sense of belonging to our places, wherever our feet are planted. A journey that was embedded in the old ways of our ancestry, of our lineage, reflecting the need to live in balance and harmony with the earth and with the other beings that inhabited alongside us, and with the community of other humans. What I've worked with since then is kind of expanding that idea into what I call, and I'm not the first person to call it this, so I'm not taking credit for the term, but what I call the post-heroic journey, which is kind of an antidote, I guess, to the hero's journey for both men and women. And so the eco-heroine's journey that I spoke about in If Women Rose Rooted would be one such post-heroic journey. It would be a journey that takes us out of this heroic, uber-individualistic, glory-filled journey that we have lived by in Western civilization for so many years, for so many centuries, I guess. And again, the stories, the old stories of our ancestry are post-heroic. We don't really need to invent new ones. They're already there. One of the stories that I love to work with, because I've studied it deeply in my forays into academia and Celtic studies, is the old Grail mythology. And everybody thinks of the Grail mythology as a heroic quest. You know, the knight from King Arthur's court goes off and quests for the Grail, and he overcomes everything and he gets the Grail and he's filled with glory. And isn't that the classical hero's journey? If you go back to the originals, it's really not. The Grail quest is a fool's journey. He is the fool in the tarot. When he sets off, he knows nothing, and he only attains the Grail by growing up. He does not attain the Grail by killing dragons or fighting battles. He doesn't even attain the Grail by slaying the odd knight, which of course they all have to do on the side. He attains the Grail by asking the compassionate question of the wounded Fisher King, "What ails thee?" That is what makes the difference. And there are stories such as the story of the Glasgavlin, as she is known in Ireland, the Dun Cow in some parts of Scotland and the north of England, otherwise known as the Cow of Plenty, where we have a wonderful cow who will give milk to anyone who asks her, a bucketful, whenever they need it, until one day a woman comes along with a sieve and milks the Glasgavlin through the sieve into multiple buckets. And because the sieve always appears to be empty, at first the Glasgavlin, the cow, doesn't realize what's happening, but as soon as she does, as soon as she understands that someone is taking too much, that someone is taking more than they deserve, more than they need even, off she goes, runs away up into the Milky Way, and she is never seen again. And you know, again, that is a classic folk tale which tells us about the need to live in balance and harmony with the land. The stories of the Cailleach, who prevent the hunter from taking too many deer, or who prevent the hunter from taking female deer while they're pregnant, who stands firm against the kind of predation of humans and says, "No more, that's enough, you may not." These are the old stories which always were post-heroic, and I think it's really only in recent centuries that we have invented the hero's journey and lived by it. And so a great passion of mine has been to go back to these old stories and to point out all of the ways in which they give us a clue. Now clearly they are stories for hundreds or sometimes a couple of thousand of years ago, and we need to re-envision them for very different and very challenging times. But that concept of a post-heroic journey where we turn back again out of individualism to a sense of community, out of a sense of we must have more, the myth of progress, the myth of more, to a sense of no, we've got enough now, we take just what we need. Those are the stories that it seems to me that we need to live by. And the final thing that I wanted to say before I open it up to you, or talk about a little bit before I open it up to you for any comments or questions that you might have, is just to reiterate some thoughts about reclaiming the feminine. Because what If Women Rose Rooted was about, at its heart, was about reclaiming the feminine, reclaiming the lost feminine, reclaiming the lost, repressed voices of women, and to an extent also reclaiming the mythic feminine, reclaiming our stories. And so, in a sense, my vision of that hasn't changed, but it's moved on a little. It's got bits added to it, I suppose, in the last 5 years as I've worked very much with this issue. In If Women Rose Rooted, the foundational story was the rape of the Well Maidens, as you will remember. It's not a story that people tend to forget once they've heard it. That very, very old story, in fact, one of the original stories in the Grail Mythology, to harken back to my last point about it being very post-heroic. And the loss of the voices of the wells, the loss of the maidens who came from the other world through the wells. And this wasn't just about the rape of the feminine, but it was a consequence of the withdrawal. The wasteland was a consequence of the withdrawal of the gifts of the other world, of life, of nourishment, of inspiration. And the wasteland that was left once the Well Maidens withdrew and the gifts of the other world were withdrawn was really a land without soul. So the questions I asked were really about how we could reclaim our ancient role as voices of the wells. Women in all of our old mythology from these islands were the upholders of the moral and spiritual authority of the other world, very clearly, as well as being guardians and protectors of the land. And that to me was what I found so inspiring when I first came across these stories and began to think of them as cosmologies and worldviews. How do we reclaim those voices? the truth is, everywhere we look today, we see more and more women doing this. And so, you know, when I was writing If Women Are As Rooted, the world was a little bit of a different place, and I tended to focus on movements of Native Americans, Native Canadians, which were very much driven by women. Now, of course, we are beginning to see more and more people like Greta Thunberg, very much stepping up from the European tradition as guardians and protectors of the land. So it is happening. But I also want to say that this whole idea of reclaiming our voices, of being guardians and protectors of the land, is not just about doing. It's not just about activism, and that is in no way to say that those things aren't important. But it's increasingly important to me that people recognize that every one of us has our own unique gift to bring to the world at this time. For some of us it's about activism, and for some of us it's something slightly different. And I think it's really important that we listen to our own sense of calling, to our own sense of what our gift is, and bring that to bear on the issue of reclaiming the feminine. Because at some level, doing is useless without being. To me, the whole process of reclaiming the feminine and of creating change in the world is always about capturing the imagination. And this is a lesson I learned when I was still practicing as a psychologist, that you can't help people change if you can't help them capture their imaginations. If what you propose to them is dull, if they're not interested in it, if it doesn't nourish them, it's not going to work. If you can capture their imagination, and of course it almost always works with a story, then you've got the beginnings of a transformation. So that we help people see what it is to live, that it's possible to live in a more enchanted way, to fall in love with the earth again. And to me that is change from the bottom up, from the individual out, and therefore it runs the risk of being much more lasting change rather than being from the top down, change imposed by regulation or politics, which is often resented. And so my work since I wrote If Women Are As Rooted has been very much about cultivating the imagination, particularly cultivating the mythic imagination with story, with myth, with archetype, about encouraging people to speak to the land, to a crow, to a stone, to kind of look at a crow or a stone or a mountain or a river in the way that I was describing earlier on. That yes, very much as a physical, as an embedded, embodied physical sensory being in this physical sensory world, but also as possessing other layers, imaginal layers that help connect us more deeply to the world. And this is about piercing the veil and listening to voices other than our own, listening to the world beyond the world, if you like. What I've been doing since If Women Are As Rooted is very much reaching out as well beyond Britain and Ireland, and revisiting other European stories and other European contexts to look at this issue of what the feminine was. And I came to do a lot of work in the past 2 or 3 years on the very ancient concept of the anima mundi, which literally translates as the world soul. And this is something that we see in early classical Greek philosophy. We see it in other cultures as well, but I'm just going to focus on that for now because we're running out of time and I need to stop talking soon. Plato wrote about it in his book Timaeus, and other Greek philosophers wrote about it afterwards, and this was their worldview, their cosmology, their spiritual belief that according to Plato, I'm going to read a quote from Plato, I think I've got it here he explains it better than I can. The world is indeed a living being endowed with a soul and intelligence, a single visible living entity containing all other living entities, which by their nature are all related. That was what Plato called the world soul, the anima mundi. The anima mundi, the world soul, was always conceived of as feminine, and some version of her has appeared in all of the old religious traditions, no matter how little they are acknowledged or have been acknowledged recently. We see her as Sophia in Gnosticism, and also in as wisdom in the Bible. We see her as the Shekinah in the Jewish tradition, and so many other things that I could talk about. But this idea of the anima mundi, which inspirits the world as a feminine force, is very similar to the concept of the divine female coming from the other world, embodying the moral and spiritual authority that we see in our native British and Celtic traditions. So Plato thought the world soul was kind of the intelligent and harmonious principle of order and of life, which exists at the heart of the cosmos and which allows the living world to unfold in the best possible way. And so it's kind of a spirit infused throughout all nature, the divine essence that kind of embraces and animates all life in the universe. And the individual soul, according to these old philosophies, is very much the anima mundi in miniature, or rather a kind of fractal. If you think of it as a fractal pattern, we have the individual soul, and then that's reflected up and up and up until finally we get to the soul of the cosmos. So the world soul in the old traditions was seen as a kind of intermediary between the human or the physical world and the divine, the all that is, the creator, the cosmos, whatever terminology you're comfortable using. And in repressing the voice of the feminine throughout these centuries, we've also been repressing the world soul. And in reclaiming the feminine and the voice of the feminine, we are reanimating the world soul. So to me, the voices of the wells of our native tradition are the voices of the world soul. And the voice of the long silenced feminine, however we conceive it, is needed in order to heal the wasteland, just as it always was. And the world is changing. You know, I think this year has made that clearer than ever to all of us, for better or for worse. Those old stories that we've been living by are crumbling. Patriarchy is crumbling, and the time is riper than it ever has been. This year particularly, that seems to me to have struck home. And it seems to me that the stories that we need to replace those very destructive tales that we've been telling about ourselves, the myth of more, the myth of progress, the myth of individuality and individual glory, the tales that we need to replace those, I think, come from that wellspring of creative, generative wisdom which belongs to the feminine, which belongs to the world soul. And we need visionaries in these times. We need stories of the land, the stories of our native traditions, and the wisdom which is encoded in them. So to finish up with, what I'd like to just offer are some questions, I guess, that I am working with, that I have, and that kind of is continuing in my work, in all the various threads of my work, from now into the foreseeable future. What are the stories we need to guide us into the future? Well, I've already kind of answered that, I suppose. I think they are the old stories, re-envisioned for the times, for different times, for more challenging times. But the old stories which help us, which inform us, and help us uncover more balanced ways to live on this earth. How do we take those old stories forward for new times? That's a big question. I think it's for each one of us to answer according to our own gifts and our own skills. How can I and you as individuals take those old stories forward today? How do we take responsibility for our own choices and let go of those damaging beliefs and patterns which have been so deeply ingrained into us they're difficult to let go of? How do we do that? How does each one of us, how do you as an individual begin to do that? How can that long silenced voice of the divine feminine, the voice of the anima mundi, how can it be acknowledged today without making the same mistakes again? Which means without relying on dogma or trying to slavishly reconstruct practices from 2,000 years ago that may not have such relevance for a very changed world. To me, it's very much about individual practice, individual knowledge, what used to be called gnosis, G-N-O-S-I-S in the good old days, and that to me involves a freedom from dogma. How do we recover our sense of being part of a cosmos which is sacred, of being part of a cosmos which is imbued by the anima mundi, by the world soul, of which we are a part, of which everything around us is a part? How do we live that day to day? And finally and ultimately, I guess, how can we embrace what is effectively a huge transformation of consciousness that needs to be made if we want to reshape a different future for coming generations. And I do think that this resurgence, which we are clearly seeing of the feminine, really does offer a new kind of consciousness, a different way of being, where the most profound wisdom of the heart in both men and women, and bear in mind that I'm not just talking about women here, I'm talking about the feminine. We're talking about qualities of compassion, of informed intellect, of that desire that is associated with the feminine to nourish, to protect, to heal, to make whole. We're talking about the ways in which both men and women can participate in that transformation of consciousness. But above all, to me, it is about a receptivity to the voice of the world soul, of the anima mundi, as displayed in our places, in the birds that we see, in the rocks that we touch, in the rivers that run through our places. They are animate too. They have answers that we don't. All the good old stories, all the good old Celtic stories tell us that the animals know things that we don't. When you run out of human wisdom, you go and ask the animals. And that respect for other forms of wisdom, that sense of listening to other forms of wisdom, is really, really important. To the ancients, to imagine in this way, to listen in this way, to fall into the land's dreaming, to use a phrase that I have coined and used very often, that is to approach the divine, whatever you may conceive it as being. So I'd like to stop there, I guess. The only, except for one thing, the only one thing that I should add is my writing. I'm sure many of you who follow my work will know this already, but my writing, the trajectory that my writing has taken is very much in the context of elderhood. As I grow older, I'm going to be 60 in the middle of next year, and the journey to elderhood preoccupies me. My own entry into elderhood hasn't quite been what I imagined for various reasons, but it's been a new journey, and it's been a challenging journey, and I'm currently spending the next 6 months finishing my book on elderhood, which is called Haggitude, which was the subject or the result of another one of those funny dreams where I woke up in the middle of the night and said Haggitude, and then woke up the next morning thinking that would be a great title for a book. So it will be, and that is what I am working on writing right now. So I would like to offer you all the opportunity to ask any questions or make any comments. And I have to say that from past experience with Vimeo, it can be quite challenging to keep up with the chat. I'm going to do my very, very best here, but if there are a lot of people asking questions or making comments at the same time, it can be kind of difficult to keep up, because the chat box that I see in front of me is very, very small. And as I explained to all of you at the beginning, I haven't been able to look at the chat while I've been talking. It's just not in my it's not something I'm capable of doing while I'm talking. But so if anybody has asked any questions or made any comments up until now, I'm so sorry, I won't have seen them. But please do have at, and I'll do my best to keep up and to answer whatever comes up in front of me. So because a lot of people are going to be watching this as a video recording and we won't be saving and publishing the chat, I'm going to read out comments that I respond to as I go along. Okay, let's get going then. Who's got something to say or to ask? There's lots of lovely comments about how many of you feel so connected to your land and have that sense that I've been talking about deep connection, about seeing beyond just the physical and the sensory. Nielsen is asking, you have a longing to teach about this as well and to take what you have learnt to people. You don't have a PhD. Is that something that you'll need in order to bring your knowledge to the people? I have always had a very strong focus on scholarship if I am teaching something that requires it, but not if I'm teaching something that doesn't. That would be the short answer. So if I am teaching about the Celtic myths and stories and the cosmologies of our ancestors, for example, then yes, I do feel an obligation to actually have read about it, to have gone to the original sources and to have studied it in a very, very deep way, because there is a huge amount of misinformation out there, probably on Celtic mythology, more than anything except psychology, which is my other training. So I really landed myself in it with this kind of work. So I think it is important to study. I mean, I'm not saying you have to go and do a PhD, and you don't necessarily have to go and do a master's degree, but I think in order to teach, you need to have lived, you need to have a lived experience, but you also do need to have, where appropriate, a knowledge. And that's something that I've really tried very strongly to bring to my work, to back up the lived experience with a real sense of apprenticeship to the material that tells us what our ancestors believed. Well, not what we would like them to have believed, but what they actually did, and to be able to judge what we do know about what they believed and what we just don't know at all. And most of it, frankly, is what we don't know, because we don't know very much. So I think it's important to put the work in, and I am a great believer in apprenticeship, but I'm also a great believer in teaching when you have something to teach, and saying when you have something to say. The world needs many of us, many different voices in our different ways of promoting the same message, or offering the same ideas of ways of being in the world. So I hope that answers your question. Karen, wondering how to find the stories of the old woman in my place. I can see now how one would be with the land and wait for the stories to emerge out of the land, but do you also recommend doing historical research? Yes, I guess so, and it's really difficult. I know that you, Karen, I know very well that you are based in North America, and that is difficult, because if you do historical research, then the folk stories that you are going to come across are the stories of Native Americans, which in a sense don't belong to you. And yet I think those stories, if you treat them with respect, tell you something about the energies that are in a land, which you can work with to create your own story. So a story which I often tell, and I have his permission to tell it, is a colleague of mine at Pacifica Graduate Institute. When I was there, he's moved up to California Institute for Integral Studies in San Francisco since, and I think he's moving on again, but a guy called Craig Chalquist, who also works on some of the issues that I work on in terms of belonging to place and the stories and the myths of place. And Craig told me a story where he had gone out into the mountains above Santa Barbara, which he liked to do, and slept one night out on the land, kind of with nothing between him and the land, and had a big dream about a serpent. And it was a very, very big dream in the Jungian sense. He didn't really quite know what it meant or what that serpent energy was. So he went back to the native peoples of that place who are involved in some of the work at Pacifica Graduate and said, look, do you know anything about a serpent? And they laughed and said, of course we know a serpent. That serpent has been here for, hundreds, probably thousands of years, and we know him. And there was no sense that that serpent energy should not talk to a white person. There was just a sense that its history with native peoples was their history. But okay, here's that serpent now talking to you. So you go and create your own stories of that serpent. What has that serpent got to say to you? And what have you got to say to him or her? And it seems to me that if we know, for example, I always use the Kaliak as my favorite example. If you know something about what the old woman in a place is, because you have that ancestral memory, or because you've been to Ireland or to Scotland and followed the tracks of the Kaliak and experienced that interaction with old woman energy, then you know what to look for in your places, because the point is that these archetypal energies are in every land. They're everywhere. They're kind of different iterations of the same archetypal energy. Like, I always think of them as kind of, the world soul wears different clothes in different countries, and it just helps you recognize it. So I suppose that's the only way that I have ever been able to explain it to people, in the same way that I found that old woman energy in the form of a heron who took off from the riverbank one day while I was walking past her and screeched. And as she screeched, I thought, that sounds for all the world like an old hag. And I went, doesn't it just? There's the old woman. And then I began to work with the heron, to think about the heron, and this character of old crane woman kind of emerged in some act of co-creation between me and the heron and the land. So I think that's how it works. It's not an instant process. I don't think these are supposed to be instant processes, but it's a deep trusting, and it comes from a deep knowing in our bones that these archetypes are part of our lineage, and we can find them wherever we go. They're there, and it's just a question of trusting and having the confidence to open up. Now, what have I got here? L. How do I personally find balance in having so many calls to the land and so many homes? I think it is that whole concept of being a serial router. I never see any place as temporary, and you know that can be heartbreaking when you leave, but it means that I wholly immerse myself in the energies of the land and in the beings, the archetypes, the, I don't know what you might, whatever word you want to use, whatever word you feel more comfortable in calling them. I don't hold myself back from them, and so I learn. And when I left Lewis, it was heartrending. That was the most difficult break I have ever made from a place, because I adored it and it had taught me everything, but I could not stay there because it was not good for me, and I haven't had a moment of doubt about that since I left. It was a teaching place, and it was a great love, and like many great loves, it was not forever, and you have to be able to let it go and to move on to the next place, and to give the next place everything you have, every bit of your heart, and to fall into it streaming as well, and then to be able to pull back and say, okay, I'm taking that part of you with me to my next place. But as I said at the beginning, the older I get, the harder I think I'm finding it to leave places behind, to leave behind anything, you know, that we love is difficult, isn't it? And I am very much hoping that I'm not going to have to do this too many times. What was interesting to me in the past couple of years, going back to America and teaching there, having lived there for 6 years, ending around 2001, yeah, that kind of time frame, and not having been back for 11 years, going back to America and finding the magic in the teaching place in New Mexico, but having no sense of obligation to live there or no desire to live there, but just to be able to sit with a place which I'd been to many times when I lived in America and say, okay, there are ways that a place can teach you where you don't actually have to go and live, but you can still learn. And that taught me, that desert in the past couple of years taught me so much that I needed to learn, that I couldn't have learned in Connemara, that I couldn't have learned in Wales. And so I think it doesn't always have to be quite as drastic, and you take your lessons where you can find them. But most of it, I think, is a funny kind of, I want to call it courage, but that sounds self-aggrandizing, and I don't mean to be, but the courage not to hold back from loving a place, knowing that you might be pulled to leave it. So, you know, none of these choices, none of these feel like they've been my personal choices. As I said at the beginning, I'm bored now, I need a new place, it's not what I thought it was, I'm dissatisfied, I'll move on. It's been the opposite. It's been a positive call rather than a kind of negative feeling that I needed to leave behind. But I've learned to trust my instincts. I've done it often enough now, and I respect place enough as a teacher that I don't make any rapid decisions. The decision to come back to Wales was quite a months-long process for me and for my husband. So I don't make snap decisions, but I trust the process when that still is left at the end of all of the what ifs and maybes and buts that you go through when you make a big move. Catherine, how to shift from stories as entertainment to deeper insights? I think it is just literally a shift in I don't think there's any trick to it. I think it's just like looking at fairy stories as not as entertainment but as spiritual insights. For example, there's a French, what was he? I never remember his discipline. Was he an anthropologist or a folklorist, a philosopher? I can't remember. A guy called René Guénon, who, will I write that in the chat for those of you who are interested? I wonder. René Guénon, oops, Guénon, who wrote a lot about folklore and the importance of folklore, and who believed that the lost wisdom, the mysteries, if you like, which had been stepped upon by the monotheistic religions, by the patriarchal religions such as Christianity, which had been wiped out, which had been driven underground, that the wisdom here, to save it from being lost, was encoded in folk and fairy tales, so that these folk and fairy tales would be passed along down the years, down the generations, until people came along who knew how to unlock the key again to that lost wisdom. And so every time I read a fairy tale or come across a folk tale, I look at it with that in mind. If this story was a key to some lost wisdom that we needed again for these times, what might that be? And I try not to overanalyze, because we can often impose the answers that we want onto things. I try to sit with the story and to let the story speak to me, and the images and the characters speak to me for quite a long time. But to me, that is it. It is also about that willingness to let the story speak. Plato and the ancients believed that stories and these archetypal characters who inhabited them had an independent existence. We think we make the stories up, right? Today, they believed that we didn't make the stories up at all. They lived somewhere else in the imaginal world, and if we were very lucky, they happened to us. And that's also a tradition that we see in the Sufi tradition, for example. And so I think it's a question of respecting the stories, kind of respecting their autonomy, and not rushing to interpret them, but just sitting with them, reading them, working with them, reflecting on them, meditating on them, dreaming into them, and letting them very slowly reveal their wisdom to us. So if we treat them with respect in that way, I think we're not treating them as entertainment. We're not treating them as objects for our own amusement. We're teaching them. We're treating them as independent beings, which can offer us something very precious if we allow that to happen. Okay, reading my chat. Lise, love the idea of not making the same mistakes. Would you expand a bit on that, referring to reclaiming the feminine? Yes, I worry that, and this is a personal thing, and I'm sure that many of you will disagree with me, and that's okay by me. But I worry sometimes that by, for example, trying to reconstruct practices that our ancestors would have used 2,000 years ago to interact with deities, with the divine, with the land or whatever, and insisting on trying to, for example, to go back and see what they believed and what they did precisely and how they did it and what they wore and what they might have said and what have you. We can't do that. Just trust me on this, because I do have a lot of background in Celtic studies and I've tried very hard to find those things. We don't actually know very much about what they practiced. We know something about their beliefs, but not what they practiced. We can't do that, for one thing. But also, I worry that if we get very attached to specific practices, to specific forms of words, to specific ways of honoring the land, honoring the divine in groups, and again in very specific ways, that we might run the risk of falling into the same patterns of, you must worship, which is a word I don't like, but you must worship in this way on a Sunday, at 9 o'clock in the morning, and you can only go to the shops if you've been absolved of your sins, and so on, and all that kind of dogma, which is which takes a lot of the meaning out of a personal relationship with the divine. I worry very much that if we attach too many labels to ourselves, that if we get too attached to specific rituals, and ritual is important, so I'm sorry if this isn't very coherent, I'm trying to make it so, but it's a complicated subject. I worry that we just end up in the same problem, that if we say to people, no, this is the way you have to believe, this is what you have to believe, this is the way you have to believe it, this is the way you have to worship it or to honor it, then we are getting into, we're falling into the same traps. And I'm a great believer in what the ancients called personal gnosis, that it is for each of us to find our path to the divine. It is for each of us to find our relationship with the land, with the world soul, because they also said that each of us, each individual soul, comes into this world called, bearing a unique gift that we chose before we were incarnated into this life to bring to this world at this time, in this place, precisely at this challenging moment. And it's for each of us to do it our way and to find our own path. And although that sounds as if it might be a little bit of a free-for-all, I think it's more honest and less damaging, less dangerous than falling into dogma. So I hope that kind of, I've tried to make a very complicated subject into a very short answer. I hope that gives some sense of it. I think we all need to take responsibility, you know, for our personal interactions with the land and the other beings that inhabit it alongside us, and with the world soul. Where I've lost my place a little bit now. Please bear with me while I catch up. Elsa, I'm sorry. I should put my glasses on. The chat is too small for me. You're suggesting that there's an interesting conflict between traditional farming culture and rewilding efforts, and that the arts are a vital force here. Yes, that's a very difficult one. It's a subject that's kind of close to my heart, and I won't spend too much time on it because I could, having worked, you know, had small holdings both now and also when we were in the Isle of Lewis, and kept animals, looked after animals. I am not one of those who believe that the whole of human history was destroyed by farming, and that the wonderful prehistoric hunter-gatherers had it all sewn up and the farmers were bad people who broke it. I'm caricaturing a worldview. Both having looked at those cultures and having looked at prehistory, there are many, many examples of that not being nearly as obvious as it might sound. And, you know, we have to eat. There are a lot of us. We can't all be hunter-gatherers anymore. We just simply can't with 9 billion people. It's just a fact of life. And so I am very passionate, nevertheless, about methods of farming which go hand in hand with rewilding. And we see it here on our small 8 acres of green fields here in Wales. They're not heavily grazed. We have sheep. We have pedigree sheep. We have sheep that are known as kind of heritage grazers, which mean that they pick and choose. You know, they don't just wipe everything out. And we don't heavily graze our fields. And so we have found this year, even though there are sheep on the fields, there are also many, many, many wildflowers. And that is achieved by not overgrazing, by rotating them around fields, and by choosing pedigree forms of sheep, or old breeds, heritage breeds of sheep, who are not just, you know, the cream blobs that wipe out everything in sight across the hills. So there are ways of doing it. It's not easy, but I'm really encouraged, particularly in this country, time and time again, by finding people who are doing it well. And so many examples of good farming and rewilding farming going on that I'm really constantly inspired by it. So lots to say about that. Emma, what mythical beings are inspiring me in my new land? Oh wow, well, I can see from this room and from another room in our house, the highest peak in the Cambrian Mountains, which is the mountains where we live, which is called Plinlimmon. That's the anglicised version, and there's a story there that Plinlimmon was a giant, and so I look at that hill, and I see a hill. It's a beautiful hill. I see frost on it sometimes, and sometimes I see it as a giant. And the giant had 3 daughters, and they were water nymphs. And to cut a long story short, because we're running out of time, those 3 daughters are 3 rivers which dominate this landscape. One of them is the Havren in Welsh, which is better known as the Severn, the River Wye, and the River Ystwyth, which runs out to the sea in Aberystwyth, out to the west here. So I suppose I am at the moment completely entranced by the River Severn, which the source of which, again, up at Plinlimmon, I can see from my window, and I've been challenged this year with rheumatoid arthritis, and I'm only just coming out of a very difficult phase of it and being able to walk again in the wild like I used to. So my goal, hopefully in the next 3 months, is to make it all the way up to Plintham. And it's not that difficult to track, but it would be difficult for me in the state that I was in a few months ago, and to go to the source of the Severn and to commune with that river, because there is something about a river that so captures my imagination. There's something so beautiful about it, particularly in its early stages, and the way that all kinds of other streams and rivers flow into it until it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and ends up in the sea. And so that is what is really capturing my imagination right now, in this land, in this after or as a consequence of this very, very difficult few months that we've all been going through. Okay, a couple more before we finish. Could I speak to the importance of intention in regard to how we relate to the land? I work in eco-psychology practices and would like to hear your insights about this aspect of any relationship when we're cultivating intimacy, sustainability and reciprocity. Intention's a difficult word, isn't it? I don't really know what I would say about intention. To me, my intention when I go out is simply to listen and to be open to whatever might want to come into me. And I'm not entirely sure that that's what you're asking about. So, but nevertheless, I think that's probably the only answer that I can give off the top of my head, that whenever I walk out of my door, and it is very, very much something that is an automatic process now, precisely because place has been such a big teacher for me, it's kind of like a switch goes on in my head, and I'm engaging with everything on at least 2 levels. So, you know, I love the big old yew trees that are around our house, because this old house once was a Methodist chapel back in the 1700s, and they're beautiful, you know, as physical objects. They're beautiful, they're shiny, they're majestic, they're old and ancient, but I approach them with a great deal of reverence and a great deal of respect and a little bit of awe, because I don't know very much about yew trees. I've never lived with them before, and they're very old beings, and I'm a little bit kind of overawed by them. So I can't just see a yew tree and not have that intention to be open to what is going on. But I guess what worries me sometimes about the concept of intention is it is my intention not to act on the world all the time, but to be open to it. And that doesn't mean to say to be passive, but I'm not going out there all of the time trying to do things to the world or with the world or around the world. It's really, to me, it is a quality of openness. We can call it listening, but it's with more than just our physical ears, isn't it? To just be aware of what wants to engage with us, rather than just blundering in and thinking that we are the ones that do all of the beginning and the engaging, and we're the ones who begin every conversation. So to me, I'm a little bit cautious about intention in everyday life. There's a place for intention, you know, but imposing our will on the world can be kind of like the shadow side of intention, and I'm very cautious about it. We've done enough of imposing our will on the world, I think, over the past few centuries. I hope that makes sense to you. Okay, one more. I thought we would run out of time with all of your questions, and we have, but I'm just going to scroll down and find, oops, I've lost my place. Yeah, unfortunately, when there are a lot of comments, Vimeo won't let me go back, so I am having to go forward. So I'm sorry, I'm losing my place. Emma, okay, let's go back to Everyone Knows Rooted. Description of the Cave of Cats of Oenagat in Ireland, so vivid and incredibly detailed. Just wondering about the timing of the writing and how you go about making this seemingly mundane so alive and rich. Well, you know, I went to Oenagat while I was writing If Women Are As Rooted, kind of in order to write about it. I mean, clearly it's a place I'd always wanted to go. It's a very magical place. It had been on my kind of to-do list or bucket list, I suppose, of special sacred places to visit around Ireland. But I went there knowing that I was writing this book and that I was writing about the darkness. And so I think part of it is kind of going there with that knowledge you know, and that you're going to be writing about it afterwards, and to think about your experience there in the context of what you're writing, because the writing is part of you. You know, it's not, that sounds a little bit kind of transactional, I suppose, as if you're kind of stealing something from the place for a product, but I don't see writing as a product. I see it as who I am, and it comes very much from the heart and very much from my own life and my own journey. It's not really constructed in any product related sense, and so it just seemed to flow. And I trust, if I have, and maybe that comes back to the earlier question about intention actually, if I go to a place with the intention, or the hope rather than the intention, I don't want it to sound too willed, if I go there with the hope or the prayer, maybe that's a better word entirely, that something of the energy of that place will flow into me so that I can in turn transform it and put it back out into the world, then that is all that's required. So to me, it's an attitude of mind and an attitude of respect. You know, not just in your relationship with the land in general, in the way that you are in it and walk through it every day, but in the way that you use it to fuel your work. Because what I try to do above everything is to let the land or whatever other characters I'm working with kind of speak through me. And I suppose I find that particularly strong when it's a different book, but when I was writing Foxfire, Wolfskin and Other Stories of Shapeshifting Women, that process of letting the archetypal women speak through you, kind of providing a vehicle, was very, very strong in my head and resulted in some very surprising stories that I certainly hadn't planned, like the Baba Yaga story in that book, for example. So again, all of this, to me, if I had to sum it up, all of those questions that you've asked around the same kind of thing are about respecting the autonomy of the stories, of the land, of the archetypal beings, and not thinking that it's all about us, not thinking that we're the ones who make them up, that we're the ones who can like run the show, and just being open and listening before we engage. So thank you all so much for being part of this, and it seems like we should have probably gone on for very much longer, doesn't it? I've really enjoyed talking about it, and I've really, really enjoyed your comments and your questions. And I just wanted to say a little bit more about, before I finish, about the Bone Cave. And also I should have done this at the beginning, but I was so flummoxed by the fact that we had our event muddled up and I had to restart that I forgot. The other story which I told in If Women Rose Rooted, which has been a really key story for me throughout my life, has been the story of the Selkie. And I know it is for many of you. That sense of losing your skin and not even knowing what it is that you've lost, but the ability somehow to regain it in a very, very magical way. The Bone Cave, actually, this doesn't look much like a cave, I guess, behind me. It looks a bit more civilized than that, but in that tall cupboard behind me is a collection of skulls, and this is one of them. And for those of you who do not know, I'm going to see, oops, okay, let me pull back a little bit. This is a seal skull. So this is one of my prides of my collection of skulls. And my husband found this seal skull on the beach in Lewis. And it just, you know, well, Selkies, seal skulls, what can I say? It's one of the most beautiful things that I possess, and it always is very carefully wrapped up whenever I move. And the Bone Cave may not look like a cave, but it is possessed of bones. And in our old mythology, it was believed that bones contained some essence of the spirit of the person after they were dead. And I am trying, I guess, in all of my work to retain the essence of the old stories, of the old ways of our ancestors' wisdom. And so it seems an appropriate metaphor in very, very many ways. So I hope that you've enjoyed this first little session in the Bone Cave, and that you'll think about joining us for more explorations next year. That the Bone Cave, proper Bone Cave sessions will be very much longer, and we'll have much more opportunity to discuss and to break out into little groups than we have been able to do here. So I would like to invite those of you who have not done so, if you'd like to enter into the draw for the free gift that I mentioned at the beginning, to pop in your email addresses here, and we will save the chat, but we won't make it public, and then we will be able to go with it. I'm just noticing, I'm sorry, as I look at the chat, apparently there have been a lot of questions about the masculine, which I haven't answered, and I'm so sorry, I haven't seen any of them, and that is because my feed is like going up and up and up and up. So let me just finish, even though I was winding down by saying that, the role of the masculine. I don't have much time to do it. It is crucially important, and I said this in If Women Rose Rooted, so again, if you've read the book, you'll know that, that this is not something that women can do by themselves. But I am a woman in a woman's body, and I find it very, I don't like it when men define my role for me, and I don't propose to define men's role for them. That is just a question of respect. It's not out of disinterest. But I have been involved, and Ruthie too, who works with me, also works with a very fine project called the Mythic Masculine. Please do Google it, or Ruthie perhaps can put, if you're still there, you can put the web address, which is a community project set up by Ian Mackenzie, a filmmaker and very fine all-round person in Canada, to look precisely at this issue of the mythic masculine and reclaiming the mythic masculine. And that is a community and a group that is open to women to join in, as well as to men, and these very complicated questions are being dealt with there in much more depth than I can here. But for those of you who doubt it, the masculine has to be a partner in all of this work of reclaiming the feminine. We cannot do it without men, and should not do it without men. But it's not for me to tell them, you know, what that way is. So thank you again for joining me, and I hope to see you in the Bone Cave in the future. I'm going to turn off my streaming now. When I do that, the chat will disappear. So let me just check that I haven't missed anything here. Ruthie, you were trying to tell me something a minute ago, and unfortunately, because I've got so many email addresses now, it's gone. If there's anything left, shout now. Otherwise, I'm going to stop my streaming. Okay. Have a good day, everybody, and have a good holiday season in this beautiful season of the deep dark. And I look forward to meeting you somewhere else down the road.